The letter arrived at 6:30 in the morning, which was how Mira Ashworth learned she had become a duchess. She did not learn it from the man himself. She had not seen the Duke of Caldenmere since the afternoon of their wedding, 43 hours prior, when he had pressed his seal into wax on a document she had not read, spoken 6 words to her across a mahogany desk. "The house accounts are yours now," and written out before the ink was dry. She learned it from his steward, Mr. Fenn, who stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the flagstone floor, explaining that His Grace had been called to London on a matter of urgent business, and that she was to consider herself mistress of Caldenmere in his absence. She had looked at the man for a long moment. The kitchen smelled of cold ash and damp. Outside, a single thrush was making conversation with itself in the copper beech, and the sound of it was the only warm thing in the room. She did not yet know how long the absence would be. She did not yet know what was waiting for her inside the locked study on the 2nd floor, or what the house accounts would teach her about the year ahead, or that the morning she stood in that kitchen would be the morning she would return to, years later, and understand as the hinge on which everything turned. She only knew that she was 23 years old, alone in a manor house with 16 rooms she had not yet entered, married to a man whose face she could no longer precisely recall. "Very well," she said, and turned back to the cold hearth and began to lay the fire herself, because there was no one else to do it. That was the first morning of the year that made her. She ought, by any sensible accounting, to have been destroyed by it. Mira Ashworth had come to Caldenmere with 2 dresses, a trunk of books, and a competence with figures that her father, a rural solicitor dead these 4 years, had considered her one useful inheritance. She had no connections worth naming, no beauty worth cataloging, and no illusions worth protecting. What she had was a head that counted things without being asked to, the cost of a candle stub, the weight of a season's grain, the precise moment a household's arithmetic stopped adding up. She had spent the 3 years since her father's death keeping accounts for a series of relations who valued her usefulness and resented her for providing it, and she had become, in that time, very good at being unnoticed. It was a skill she had found. You wore it like a color, gray, serviceable, forgettable. You agreed to things readily, disagreed rarely and precisely, and you watched, because watching cost nothing, and paid in compound interest. She had watched the Duke of Caldenmere at their one prior meeting, a half-hour in a solicitor's office in Thornfield, arranged by a cousin she barely knew, the whole transaction politely transactional. And she had catalogued what she saw, a man of perhaps 32, broad-shouldered and grave, with working hands and a face that had arranged itself into a permanent expression of controlled wariness, as though he were waiting for news he already suspected would be bad. He had answered every question she put to him in full sentences, and had not once looked at her as though she were furniture. It was the most encouraging thing she had encountered in 3 years of discouraging arrangements, and she had accepted his offer on those grounds, which she understood was not romantic, but was entirely honest. She had not expected to be abandoned in an empty manor inside 48 hours of the vows. She had, upon reflection, prepared herself for worse things. The house accounts were the first proof that something was wrong, and not wrong in the way she had assumed. She found them on the 2nd morning in the estate office off the main hall, a room that smelled of cedar and old paper and something sharper underneath, something she couldn't name but filed away. The way she always filed things she didn't yet understand. The ledgers went back 11 years. She sat down with the oldest one and read it straight through before noon, then read the next, then the next. Because figures spoke to her more plainly than people did, and what these figures were saying was something she needed to be certain she heard correctly. By the time Mr. Fenn knocked to ask whether she required anything for luncheon, She had covered the desk in open books and was staring at a number she had written twice on a separate sheet to be sure she hadn't imagined it. She looked up. Fen was somewhere near 60, dry as old timber, with the particular economy of expression that belongs to men who have served difficult households long enough to have opinions about everything and voice them about nothing. He had been at Caldenmere for 30 years. He stood in the doorway with his coat buttoned precisely and his face carefully absent. "Mr. Fen," she said, "the household expenditure in this column for the past 3 years is approximately 40% above the recorded income from the estate's farmable acreage. Can you account for that?" Something moved in his face. Not alarm. It was too controlled for alarm. More like a man who has been waiting for a particular door to open and is not sure whether to be relieved. His Grace managed those accounts personally, Your Grace. Yes, I can see that his signature is on them. That isn't what I asked. She kept her voice even. She set the pen down. I am asking whether the arithmetic makes sense to you. The silence ran long enough that the thrush outside filled it twice over. Then Fen said, carefully, I have had certain questions. Good, said Mira. Sit down. Let us have them together. It was the first conversation she had in that house that was not about furniture inventory or meal schedules, and she would later count it as the moment Caldenmere began, quietly, to decide whose it was. The weeks arranged themselves into a pattern that was, outwardly, unremarkable, and inwardly the most concentrated education of her life. She walked every acre she was physically able to walk. She spoke to the tenant farmers, a courtesy no one appeared to have performed in some years, and what they told her, carefully, with the sideways caution of people who had learned to be careful. She filed alongside what the ledgers were telling her and the figure she kept returning to, roughly £600 a year, missing, and missing not as error but as design. The shape of it was too deliberate for carelessness. Money does not lose itself in the same place 3 years running. A letter arrived from London in the 4th week. It was the first communication from the Duke of Caldenmere since the 6 words across the desk, and it was extremely brief. He hoped she found the house adequate. The London matter was proving protracted. She was to apply to his man of business in Thornfield for any immediate wants. It was signed with initials. She read it twice, noted that it told her nothing about a return date, and set it in the correspondence file she had begun for his letters, which now contained 1 entry. She wrote back a 6-page summary of the estate accounts. She did not know if she expected a response. She received none for 3 weeks, and when the response came, it was 4 lines that said the accounts were in hand and thanked her for her attention. It was so perfectly uninformative that it had almost the quality of art. She filed it and kept reading ledgers. The second letter arrived on a Tuesday in the 7th week of his absence, and it did not come from London. It came from a woman named Mrs. Vance, written on expensive stationery in a hand that was very beautiful and very controlled, addressed to the Duchess of Caldenmere, which struck Mira as significant. Most correspondents were still uncertain of her title and addressed her with a slight hesitation that showed in their phrasing. Mrs. Vance showed no such uncertainty. The letter inquired, with enormous courtesy, whether the Duchess intended to remain at Caldenmere for the season, and whether she had given any consideration to the matter of the Thornfield Assembly, which Mrs. Vance was managing that year, as she managed it most years, and for which she had already reserved a role for any lady of the manor who cared to take it. Mira read it 3 times and then brought it to Fen. Who is Mrs. Vance? Fen took the letter, read it once, and returned it. His face had gone very carefully somewhere else. She manages much of the county's social calendar, Your Grace, a widow of some substance. Her family has had dealings with Caldenmere for many years. She is very free with my title. She has, he paused. She has always known Caldenmere well. It was not what he meant to say. She could tell from the pause before it, and the flatness of it, that something had been edited, and the something that had been edited was the piece that would explain the particular quality of Mrs. Vance's confidence. Mira put the letter in a different file. She wrote back to Mrs. Vance, briefly, precisely, civilly, that she would be pleased to attend the assembly and that she was grateful for the welcome. She had not yet met the woman. She was already paying attention. The assembly was on a Friday in the 3rd week of October, and it was the first time Mira had left the manor grounds since her arrival. She wore the better of her 2 dresses, which was the dark green wool, and Mrs. Partridge, the cook who had become, by default and in the absence of anyone else, the closest thing Mira had to a domestic ally, had done something to her hair that was more complicated than what Mira usually managed, and considerably better. She arrived alone, which created a small difficulty at the door that was resolved by the lending of Fenn's arm, and she entered the Thornfield assembly rooms for the first time as the Duchess of Caldenmere, which was a sentence she still, privately, found some distance between herself and the actual meaning of. Mrs. Vance was waiting. She was tall, perhaps 10 years Mira's senior, the kind of beautiful that is not accidental. It is curated, maintained, deployed at a precise angle to produce a precise effect. She wore pale gray with perfect discretion and moved through the room with the ownership of a woman who had never needed to hurry. She crossed to Mira immediately, which meant everyone watched, and took both her hands with a warmth so accomplished it would have been impossible to object to without seeming graceless. "Your Grace." Her voice was low and musical. "How very good of you to come. We have wondered so much about you." "We," Mira noted, "not I. The county has been very kind," Mira said, which was neither true nor false, and committed her to nothing. "You must find it dreadfully quiet at Caldenmere." Mrs. Vance held her hands a beat longer than necessary. Her eyes were light gray and attentive, and they read Mira with professional speed, especially at this time of year, especially alone. "I am not much troubled by quiet," said Mira. "No, I imagine you are not." Mrs. Vance released her hands, and her smile remained exactly as warm as before, which was informative. "I hope we may become great friends. I have been a friend to Caldenmere for a very long time." There it was again. Caldenmere, not the Duke, not the family. The house, as though she belonged to it. Mira smiled pleasantly and changed the subject to the assembly's charity arrangements, and Mrs. Vance obliged with perfect grace, and all the while Mira counted. The number of times Mrs. Vance touched people as she guided them, the number of times she placed herself between Mira and a potential conversation, the number of times she mentioned Caldenmere, 5, without once mentioning the Duke by name. Not avoidance. Precision. You only leave a thing out of a sentence so deliberately when you are certain that sentence will be heard by someone for whom the leaving out means something. Mira accepted 2 glasses of ratafia and danced once with the magistrate's son, and went home at 10 o'clock with a great deal of new information and the first real sense that the missing £600 a year and Mrs. Vance's extraordinary confidence and her husband's departure 48 hours after their marriage were not 3 separate problems at all. The letter she had been waiting for arrived on a Wednesday, which she would not have predicted, and it arrived from Fenn rather than from London. He came to the estate office at 8:30 in the morning with his hat in both hands, his face carefully composed, and the particular quality of stillness that she had learned meant he was about to tell her something he had spent the night deciding to tell her. He set an envelope on the desk. It was old, 6 or 7 years old by the state of the paper, and it had been opened, refolded, and resealed imperfectly, and her name was not on it. The name on it was the Duke's, Adrian, in a woman's hand she recognized from a piece of stationery she had filed 9 weeks ago. "I found it this morning," said Fen, behind the false back of the lower left drawer of the estate office cabinet. "I believe it has been there some years. I do not believe it was placed there by His grace." She looked at him steadily. "You believe it was moved there. I believe it was moved there from the correspondence box, where it should have been. I believe it was moved there so that it would not be read." She thought of the figure she kept returning to, £600 a year, missing with a designer's precision. She thought of the way the ledgers had a different smell in the sections corresponding to the last 3 years, just slightly, just under the cedar, as though another hand had been over them. She thought of Mrs. Vance saying, "I have been a friend to Caldenmere for a very long time." She wrote to London that afternoon. Not to the Duke's man of business. To the Duke. She wrote 3 pages. The first described what the ledgers showed. The second described the letter and where it had been found. The third was 1 sentence, and the sentence said, "If you will come home, I believe I can show you the shape of what has been done to you." She sealed it, gave it to the fastest courier Fen could find, and went back to the estate office, where she worked until midnight and did not permit herself to think about whether he would come. He came on a Thursday, 12 days later, at 2 in the afternoon, which she knew because the thrush went suddenly silent, and a moment later she heard wheels on the gravel. She did not go to the window. She stayed at the desk, her hands steady over the ledger she had been reading, and waited. She heard the front door, Fen's voice, footsteps on the hall flagstones, and then the estate office door opened, and the Duke of Caldenmere was standing in the room for the first time in 11.5 months. He was larger than she had remembered. That was the first thing. And thinner in the face, and the gray at his temples was more of it than she had held in her memory, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. Not the controlled wariness she had catalogued at their first meeting, but something that had been struck, hard, recently, and had not yet settled back into its trained shape. He said, "You stayed." It was not what she had expected him to say. She had prepared for questions, for formal greetings, for the slightly apologetic pragmatism that had characterized their whole acquaintance. She had not prepared for those 2 words in that voice. "Yes," she said. "Did you expect otherwise?" He stopped. He was looking at the desk, at the 16 months of ledgers laid out in her system, tabbed and annotated in the margins in her small, precise hand. He pulled out the chair across from her without being invited and sat down. And he looked at her work the way a man looks at something he has been handed in the dark and only just now understood the shape of. "I expected it," he said slowly, "to be considerably more comfortable to abandon." She looked at him for a moment. "You thought I would leave." "I thought." He pressed his thumb against his first 2 fingers, a brief hard press, and released it. "I thought you would find it intolerable enough to justify the leaving. Yes, it was not a generous expectation." "No," she said. It was not. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to the column she had marked in red. "Look at this." They sat across the desk from each other for 2.5 hours. He did not speak for the first 10 minutes. He read. And she watched him read, and she watched the moment he found the first number that shouldn't be there, and then the second, and then the shape of it. His hands were flat on the ledger. They did not move. That was the expression of feeling in him she was beginning to understand, not heat, not movement, but the particular quality of stillness that belongs to someone taking something with their whole strength. "Who else has seen this?" he said finally. "Fen, no one else." Fen knew. Fen suspected. He did not know until I asked him to help me trace it. She turned to the second ledger. "It goes back further than I initially thought. 11 years in patches. The systematic removal is 3 years, but the access is older." He was very still. She has had the keys for 11 years. Not a question. She looked at him. Mrs. Vance, he said. It came out flat, without inflection, the way you say a thing you have been carrying at some cost and have just set down. You know about Mrs. Vance. I met her at the Thornfield Assembly. I have had certain impressions. I have not been certain of the nature of the connection. He looked at the window. The light through it was the low amber of a November afternoon, and it crossed the edge of the desk and touched his hands, and she could see the working knuckle quality of them, the slight roughness that was not accidental, and she thought, the hands are honest. Whatever else he withheld, the hands did not lie. I believed her to be a friend of the family. An intimate friend, someone who had acted in a motherly capacity after my mother died when I was 19. I trusted her with the house in my absences. There were a great many absences. He turned back from the window. Something in his face had shifted into a harder angle. I trusted her with a great deal. She intercepted your correspondence. He was very quiet. The letter I sent you, said Mira, with the account summary. In the 7th week. You did not respond with anything substantive. But 3 weeks later, I received a letter from Mrs. Vance regarding the assembly. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on any face directed at her in some years. It was not pity. It was closer to the look a person gives something they have newly understood the cost of. I did not receive a letter from you about the accounts. The silence between them was the longest of their marriage, which was not yet quite a year old. What did you receive? She said. A note. 3 lines. You found the house satisfactory. You wished him to know you intended to return to your cousins at the new year, as the arrangement had proven the word used was unsuitable. He stopped. I answered it in kind. I assumed I had badly misjudged the whole business, that you had made a polite exit and I was not to press you. Mira looked at him for a long time. She thought about the green wool dress and the 2 glasses of ratafia and Mrs. Vance's hands on hers, warm as the fire, in a house where she was burning the timber. She thought about 11 months alone in a house that did not yet know her name, reading ledgers at midnight, interviewing tenants in the cold, laying the kitchen fire herself in the first gray of morning because there was no one else. She thought about what it had cost, what she had paid for it, and whether she was angry or something that was not quite anger but lived in the same country. She wrote it, Mira said. She wrote your answer as well, I expect. Yes, he said. I see that now. You should have come home. The words came out plainly, without armor, which surprised her. She did not usually spend words that did not have somewhere to go. But they were true, and true things had a habit of speaking themselves at the worst possible moments, and the moment in question was the worst and the best and the most honest of all of them, so she let them stand. He looked at her across the desk and the ledgers and the 11 months of silence between them, and he said, Yes, I should have. That was the second thing she had not expected him to say. 2 in one afternoon was more than she had budgeted for. It was Fen who broke it, a knock on the door and his dry voice saying that dinner had been ready for 20 minutes, and Mrs. Partridge had expressed an opinion on the matter that he preferred not to relay verbatim. The Duke looked at the door, and for one moment she caught it. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. But it was the first voluntary movement of his face that was not controlled wariness or grief held at a distance, and it was, she thought, the most he had offered her. We should not keep Mrs. Partridge waiting, she said. No, he agreed. It is not, I am given to understand, a safe practice. They went to dinner. The following weeks had the quality of a house relearning itself. He had been away 11 months, and in those months the estate had been, under Mira's hand, quietly transformed, not in any dramatic sense, Nothing that announced itself, but in the way a body recovers from a long fever, function by function, room by room, the color coming back. The tenant accounts were accurate, the correspondence was filed. The household ran on a schedule that was not theatrical but was real and could be relied upon, which is a different and considerably rarer thing. He found it out room by room, fact by fact, in the way that he operated, not asking directly, but observing with a thoroughness she recognized as kindred to her own. He was present at breakfast every morning. This was the first fixed fact of the new arrangement. She was already at the table with a ledger when he came down, and he poured his own coffee, which she noted because he could perfectly well have rung for it, and he sat across from her and read his correspondence without offering opinions on hers. It was, she thought, the most companionable silence she had spent since her father's house. She did not say this, she filed it. "You spoke to Halloran," he said one morning, without looking up from his letter. Halloran was the tenant on the east field, the most suspicious of the lot, the one who had taken 3 visits before he would tell her anything straight. "He came to me. In the end," she said, "he had a concern about the mill lease. It was legitimate. He has not spoken to anyone at the house voluntarily in 6 years. He is not unfriendly. He is cautious. They are different things." He looked up then. He looked at her for a moment with that particular quality. The struck and settling expression that she was learning was how he regarded things he had not predicted. And then he went back to his letter. "The mill lease should be renegotiated by the new year," he said. "I would be glad of your observations before I write to the solicitor." It was, she thought, the exact nature of his version of compliment. Not "I am impressed" or "you have done well," but "I want your observations," which was so much rarer and so much more. The first time he laughed was on a Thursday, which she would not have been able to tell you at the time, but which she would remember precisely, with the quality of a date that only becomes significant in retrospect. Mrs. Partridge had sent up, for reasons that remained her own private counsel, a pudding that was architecturally ambitious and structurally unsound, and it had arrived at the table in a state that Mira described, without quite meaning to, as an edifice in its final hours. He looked at it, and then at her, and the sound that came out of him was brief and surprised and entirely genuine, a laugh that seemed to have escaped before he could decide whether to permit it. He looked slightly startled by it himself. She did not draw attention to it. She served the pudding as though nothing had happened, and he ate it with perfect composure, and that night before she slept she thought, "There it is. The first one. Filing it now." She knew she was in some difficulty. She had known it, in the honest back shelf of her mind, for several weeks, and she had filed it carefully and not examined it too closely, because the difficulty was of the kind that wanted examining at the wrong moments, and she had other things to do. But she was sufficiently honest, alone in the dark, to name it. She had married a stranger as a practical arrangement, and the stranger had turned out to be someone she respected, which was not supposed to happen in practical arrangements, and the respecting had become, without consultation or permission, something warmer and considerably more inconvenient. She did not plan to do anything about it. The stakes were too entangled. He had come back because of the accounts, and whatever he thought of her was shaped by the accounts, and she was not interested in gratitude dressed up as something else. The declaration, if there was ever one, would have to be separate from the ledgers entirely, or it would not mean what she needed it to mean. She set this understanding firmly on the back shelf alongside the rest of it, and continued doing her work. Mrs. Vance came to call on a Saturday in December, and Mira was not surprised, because she had been counting toward it for 3 weeks. She had given some thought to how it would go. She had given more thought to what she would need in order for it to go the way she intended. The morning before the call, she found what she had been looking for. She had been through every drawer in the estate office twice and the correspondence cabinet 3 times, and the thing she was looking for was not in any of the obvious places, which meant it was either destroyed or in the non-obvious place she had been saving for last. The non-obvious place was a small locked box in the back of the library's lower shelving, behind a row of agricultural texts no one had touched in 20 years. She had seen it on her second week at Caldenmere, and had noted it and moved on and come back to it twice, and each time the lock had held. The key to it was on no ring she could find, which was itself information. She did not pick the lock. She brought the box to the Duke at breakfast and set it on the table between their cups and said, "Do you know what this is?" He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a key that he wore on a plain ring with no other keys, and she thought, "He has been carrying it. He has been carrying it this whole time, and he has not opened it, which means he is afraid of what is inside. Which means he knows something is inside, which means he has known for longer than I have that there was something wrong to know." He turned the key. He lifted the lid. Inside were 3 letters and a small folded paper, and on the folded paper was a column of figures in a hand she had seen before, in the ledgers, in the sections that smelled different. He read them. She watched him. She watched the color in his face drain down and then settle back as something colder and more precise. His hands were flat on the table. He did not move them. He read all 3 letters twice. Then he closed the box and looked at her across the breakfast table and said, "How long have you suspected?" "Since the 7th week." "I was not certain until I found where she'd moved your letter. You did not tell me when I came home. I did not have enough of it yet." She kept her voice even. "I have enough of it now." The figures on the folded paper account for the precise discrepancy in the ledgers over 3 years. The letters authorize the removals in her hand. I do not know who she paid to make the alterations in the accounts, but I know which figures were altered, and I can demonstrate it by comparison with the tenant records she did not have access to. He was very still for a very long time. Outside, the thrush had come back and was conducting its one-sided debate with the copper beech. "She told me," he said slowly, "when my father died, I was in the north. It came late. I was not." He stopped. The thumb pressed against the first 2 fingers. Once, released, she managed everything. She was already here. She knew the house. It was natural to leave the keys, and it was natural to trust her, and I should not have trusted anyone with both at once. But I was not yet 30, and I was grieving, and it seemed the obvious arrangement. She has been here every time you were away. And I was away a great deal. He looked at the box. My father was not a careful manager. The estate was strained when I inherited it. I spent years in London and Edinburgh working to clear the obligations, and while I was doing that, he stopped again. She was undoing it, bit by bit, the arithmetic of it. "The mathematics are very elegant," said Mira, not without grimness. "She is not without skill." "No," his voice was flat and final. "She is not." They sat in silence for a moment that was not comfortable, but was honest, which was its own kind of company. Then Mira said, "She is coming to call tomorrow." He looked at her sharply. "I have been expecting it since your return. She will want to take the measure of the situation. She will bring some piece of intelligence as a gift, and watch how we receive it." She folded her hands on the table. "I would like to know what you intend." "I intend." He looked at the box. He looked at it the way you look at something you have been handing someone else to carry without quite seeing what you were doing. "What do you intend?" "I intend to let her speak," said Mira, "and then I would like to have the Thornfield magistrate here. And Mr. Alcott from the bank." She paused, and the 3 tenants who witnessed her signature on the mill accounts in August. I have already spoken to them. He looked at her for a long moment. The warmth that moved through his face in that moment was brief and not performed and entirely real, and it cost him something to let her see it, and she thought, 2 things in one morning. She was going to have to revise her accounting. "Give me a list," he said, "of who you need." The morning of Mrs. Vance's call was cold and bright, the kind of December day that looks generous and is not. Mira came down to the front parlor at 10:30, dressed in a dark blue wool she had purchased with her own allowance, the first piece of clothing that was neither gray nor the green dress, and found Fen at his post by the door with an expression of immovable neutrality that she had come to understand as his version of high anticipation. The Duke was in the library, visible through the half-open door. He had been there since 8. He would not enter the parlor until she sent for him, which they had agreed the night before, sitting on opposite sides of the fire with their respective books, in the entirely easy silence that had become the primary texture of their evenings. She had said, looking at her page, "I would like to do the first part alone." He had turned a page and said, without looking up, "Yes. I thought you would." Mrs. Vance arrived precisely at 11, which was itself information, not fashionably late, not precipitously early, exactly on the hour, the call of someone who believes they set the terms. She was in deep plum, impeccable, and she brought with her a basket of preserved fruits from her own kitchen and a quality of warmth so polished that it took work to see it was not entirely warmth. She embraced Mira's hands at the door, remarked on the parlor's improved aspect, and settled herself in the better chair near the fire, with the ownership of a woman who had sat in it before. "You have worked miracles," she said, glancing around the room. "This house was so dreadfully neglected. I always felt it so, in those long months." "You were here often," said Mira, "as often as was wanted. Caldenmere has always had a call on me." She set the basket on the side table and turned her light gray eyes on Mira with their professional reading speed, and for a fraction of a moment something moved behind them, a quick recalculation, fast as a card turned over. "How are you finding it now that Adrian has returned? It must be an adjustment, after so long your own mistress." "I find it suits us both very well." "I am glad." The warmth was in full voice now, full deployment. He has needed someone capable for a long time. His previous arrangements, but never mind that. The past is the past. She smiled. "I wonder if he has told you much about the house's history. There is a great deal I could tell you, if you wished it. I know Caldenmere perhaps better than any living person." "I have been reading the history in the ledgers," said Mira. "I find them very instructive." The fraction of a silence that followed was very small. A trained observer might have missed it. Mira did not miss it. "How industrious you are," said Mrs. Vance. "I am not surprised. You have such an eye for detail." "My father was a solicitor," said Mira. "He taught me that documents do not lie, even when people are telling them to." She kept her voice warm and conversational, as though discussing the weather's character. They keep a record. Long after the hand that wrote them has forgotten, the document remembers. Mrs. Vance set down her teacup. She did it without sound, without hurry, with perfect composure. She looked at Mira over the rim of it with those attentive gray eyes, and she said, still in the warm voice, "What a remarkable thing to say." "I have been finding remarkable things in the Caldenmere records all year," said Mira. "I have been finding them in some detail." There it was, the smallest possible flinch, a compression around the eyes, quickly resolved. "If there are questions about the accounts, Mrs. Vance said, with magnificent equanimity, "you need only apply to me directly. I have always managed them with complete transparency, Ask anyone who has had reason to look." "I have asked them," said Mira. She went to the bell and pulled it once. Mr. Fenn opened the parlor door. Behind him came Mr. Alcott from the Thornfield Bank, who had the demeanor of a man who does not wish to be in the room he is in, but is a dutiful man. And behind him came all three tenants, Halloran in the front, with his hat in his hand and his chin up, and the other two flanking him. And then, last, the magistrate, Mr. Grayville, 60 and correct and carrying the specific quality of authority that comes from knowing the law well enough to be made uncomfortable by the violation of it. And finally, Fenn stood aside, and the Duke of Caldenmere came in, and he walked across the room and stood beside Mira's chair, which he had not done before, which was its own statement, entirely legible. Mrs. Vance looked at all of them. The warmth in her face did not disappear. Exactly. It became something else. The structural form of warmth without its content, the way a window holds the shape of light after the sun has moved. "Mr. Grayville," said Mira, "thank you for coming. I believe you know everyone present." She set the locked box on the table between them. "I should like to demonstrate something." What she demonstrated took 40 minutes, and it was not theatrical. She had no taste for theater, and she did not perform it. She went through each piece in order, the correspondence, the ledger alterations, which Alcott confirmed from his own bank records with the careful assent of a man who has been worried about something for 3 years and is now being given permission to say so. The folded paper with its figures in Mrs. Vance's hand, and then the letters. The letters were read aloud. They were in Mrs. Vance's handwriting, authorizing specific withdrawals, naming specific accounts, signed with an intimacy that belonged to someone who had believed she could not be touched. Through all of it, Mrs. Vance sat still. She did not speak until Mira reached the last letter, and then she said, perfectly controlled, "You cannot know when those were written." Mira set the letter down. She looked at Mrs. Vance directly, and she said, "Who paid the miller's clerk to make the alterations in August?" She asked it quietly, without inflection, the way you ask a thing you already know the answer to. She was not asking Mrs. Vance, she was asking it to the room, and the room contained, among others, Halloran, who had been to the mill in August on a matter of the lease, and who had seen something he had not been asked about until 3 weeks ago, when Mira had asked him. Halloran looked at Mrs. Vance. His chin was still up. He said, in his flat, deliberate voice, "I saw her speak to young Treadwell the morning after the July accounts were filed." She gave him something in an envelope. He made the changes the following week. He told me himself what was in it, a note and 10 shillings. Mrs. Vance looked at Halloran. Then she looked at the letters. Then she looked at the window, which offered nothing in return. And then she looked at her own hands on the arms of the chair, and the quality of looking at them was different from all the other looking she had done. It was the look of someone privately showing themselves the shape of what they have made, and recognizing it fully for the first time. Something passed over her face that was not the warmth without content, and was not the calculation. It was older and more private, and it read, to Mira's close attention, as grief. Genuine grief, the kind that does not perform. She had been at Caldenmere for 11 years, and Mira thought she understood, with sudden clarity, that the woman before her had spent 11 years in a house she believed, in some real and aching sense, was hers by right, by love, by the long work of occupying it, and had been twice wrong, wrong that it would be given to her, and wrong that taking was the same as having, and the punishment of that error had just arrived, in a blue wool dress, in front of witnesses, with the documents laid out in neat columns. It was not forgiveness, but it was the thing that makes forgiveness possible. "I will not," said Mira, "involve the law in this matter." She kept her voice even and addressed this to Mr. Grayville, who had been listening with the sustained, contained attention of a man who is serving as the instrument of record rather than of judgment. I would like it recorded that the following arrangement is agreed to voluntarily and without condition. Mrs. Vance will withdraw from all involvement with Caldenmere and its estate business, effective today. I am prepared to say, to anyone who asks, only that she has retired from her social commitments due to a matter of private concern. I am not prepared to say more than that, and she is not to say more than that. She paused. The funds taken will be forgiven as a debt. The room was extremely quiet. Why? Said Mrs. Vance after a moment, and it was the most human thing she had said since she sat down, stripped of everything. Because the people in this room are more protected by privacy than they are served by scandal, said Mira. And because you loved this house badly, which is a different thing from not loving it at all. Mrs. Vance looked at her for a long time. The beautiful face was not beautiful in that moment. It was simply a person's face, in a difficult moment being looked at plainly. She stood. She picked up her gloves from the table. She did not look at the Duke, who had not spoken once in the entire proceeding and had not needed to. She walked to the door and Fen held it, and at the threshold she stopped and looked back at Mira and she said, "You have managed it better than I would have." It was not an apology. It was, Mira thought, the closest to one she was capable of. She nodded once, and the door closed, and the room filled with the particular quality of air that follows the end of a long-held difficulty. Mr. Grayville spoke to the Duke in a low voice in the corner. Alcott was organizing his documents with the concentrated relief of a man resetting his professional conscience. Halloran stood with his hat still in his hand and looked at the floor, and then at Mira with an expression that was not warmth, but was something more durable than warmth. It was the look of a man revising a long-held estimate. She thanked him. He said she was welcome, in the flat voice, and that the mill lease situation was much appreciated. She told him they would settle it at his convenience. He went out with the other two tenants, and then it was just herself and Fen and the Duke. Fen looked at the table and then at Mira and he said, with magnificent dryness, "Shall I bring the luncheon in, or is there more to be done?" The Duke's mouth moved, and this time it was not the escape of it, not the startled letting go of the first laugh in November. It was deliberate and full, and it transformed the gravity of his face in the way that genuine amusement transforms it and nothing else can. It was a real smile, the first real smile she had seen from him in all their months of shared silence and shared work. And it was extraordinary, and she was looking at it without permission, and she did not look away. "Bring luncheon, Fen," she said. Fen withdrew in the immovable neutral way, and then they were alone, and the room smelled of cedar from the fire, and the December light was doing something precise and particular through the west window, and the Duke was still standing beside her chair, near enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, and she was suddenly, acutely conscious that the material situation, the accounts, the proof, the proceeding just concluded, was over. There was nothing more to do. The ledgers were settled. The arrangement was secure. The practical reason for everything that had passed between them was, at this moment, complete, and what remained was not practical at all. She turned to face him. He was looking at her. The struck and settling expression was there again, but it had settled into something else this time. It had settled into certainty, quiet and entire, the expression of a man who has been looking at a thing from a distance for a long time and has finally stopped pretending he cannot see it. "I owe you," he began. "You do not," she said, immediately. "If that is what you mean to say, please don't. I stayed because I chose to. What I built here, I built because I wanted to. It is not a debt." He was quiet. "If you have something else to say," she said, which she had not planned to say and said anyway, "say it as something else." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the thrush had come back to the copper beach, apparently indifferent to the fact that the shape of several lives had just been rearranged in the room behind it. Then, he reached into his coat, the inner pocket, the one where the key had been, and he took out a small folded paper. He held it out. She took it. She unfolded it. It was her letter, the 3-page letter she had written in October, with the account summary and the description of the found envelope and the last sentence. "If you will come home, I believe I can show you the shape of what has been done to you." He had kept it. He had kept it in the same pocket as the key, which meant he had been carrying them together, and she thought, he has been carrying this for 2 months, the letter she had written, not knowing if he would come. He had kept it and come home and carried it. She looked up. "I have read it many times," he said. The last line. "I have thought about it a great deal, which I have not, until this morning, been in any position to say aloud." He looked at her with the quiet certainty that had resolved from all the other expressions of his face. "Marry me because you wish it. Not because of what you found in the ledgers, not because it is already done on paper. Because you choose to. I will take no other reason, and I want to make that very plain." She thought of the things she had put on the back shelf in the dark, the respecting that had become something warmer, without permission, and she thought of Mrs. Partridge's pudding in its final architectural hours, and the morning in October when she had laid the kitchen fire alone before the Manor knew her name, and the way the copy of her own letter looked in his handwriting, carried for 2 months in the same pocket as the only key he wore on his person. She thought about the 11 months she had spent in this house that had become. In some sense, she had not predicted, and could not now undo, hers. "Yes," she said, "I wish it." That was all. It was entirely sufficient. They were married again, quietly, in the Thornfield Parish Church on a Wednesday in the first week of the new year, with Fen as witness and Mrs. Partridge weeping without any apparent attempt at concealment in the second pew. The magistrate Grayville attended because he had happened to be in the vicinity and did not explain why. Halloran sent a note the morning of with a terse and dignified expression of goodwill that Mira considered one of the more sincere congratulations she received. The ceremony was 14 minutes, which suited them both. Fen gave a speech at the wedding breakfast that lasted 6 minutes and contained 3 epigrams of considerable quality. Mrs. Partridge wept through all of it and then produced a pudding of such ambitious structural perfection that it inspired genuine applause, and the Duke looked at Mira across the table and said, under cover of the applause, in a voice that was entirely private, an edifice at the height of its powers, and she thought, I am going to be telling this story for years. The redeemable rival in this case was not a rival but a creditor, a cousin of the Duke's who had been cold and dismissive at every prior encounter, and who, upon receiving the new account statements in January, wrote a letter of extraordinary civility, offering favorable terms on an outstanding obligation and expressing, with considerable dignity, that he had formed an incorrect impression of the Duchess and was glad to be corrected. Mira wrote back in equal measure. They became, if not warmly allied, at least reliably straight with each other, which is the better foundation. Halloran's mill lease was settled on terms the tenant had been seeking for 6 years. The 3 tenant farms on the East Field returned to full cultivation by spring. Young Treadwell the clerk was dismissed from the mill's employment and found work in another county, and was, to the best of anyone's knowledge, keeping honest accounts and doing well. Mrs. Vance left Thornfield the week after the proceeding and took a house in the South, near a sister. She wrote one letter, 2 months later, which was not addressed to either of them but to Fen, who had served her also, and the letter asked after the Copper Beech. Fen brought it to Mira without comment. She wrote back to Mrs. Vance, in her own hand, that the copper beech was in good health and the thrush had returned for the second year running. She did not know if that was a mercy or something smaller. She sent the letter anyway. Spring came to Caldenmere in the ordinary way, which meant all at once, one morning the copper beech bare, and the next, or so it seemed, everything green and the light full of it, pouring through the west window of the estate office with its usual frankness. Mira was at the desk at 6:30 on a morning in early May, which was where she was most mornings, and the thrush was in the beech, and the door opened, and the Duke came in with 2 cups of coffee, which he had been doing since February, and which she had never once commented on for fear that commenting would somehow stop it. He set 1 cup beside her ledger and took the chair across the desk and opened his correspondence, and the light moved on the table between them, and the thrush made its case to the beech, and the estate office smelled of cedar and new paper, and the particular quality of a house that has found, after some difficulty, the shape it was always meant to be. She looked up. He was already looking at her, with the quiet certainty that had been the settled expression of his face for 5 months now, and she thought of the morning she had stood in the cold kitchen with the ash and the single warm bird, not yet knowing the cost of what she was beginning, and she thought, it would have been worth it. Not knowing, it would have been worth all of it. She turned back to her ledger. He turned back to his letter. Outside, the thrush continued its argument with the copper beech, which had not yet conceded the point and showed no sign of doing so. The accounts, at last, were honestly kept. If this story warmed you, the woman who laid her own fire in a cold house and found, by the end of it, that the house and everyone in it had learned her name, then you are the kind of listener we keep a chair for here, and the fire has not gone down. There is always a story beginning at this hearth, and the kettle is already on, and your seat has been waiting. Come back and sit with us again soon. Tell me in the comments, which moment held you longest, the morning Mira read those ledgers alone, or the afternoon she laid the letters out in the light before witnesses? I read every answer, and I am always glad to know what catches. Stay close and keep a candle for the ones who carried your lamp when they had no reason to. Until next time, sleep well and be gentle with the overlooked.